afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Monday. Welcome to a new week here at the Northeast Georgia History Center in the digital studio, where we're going to be bringing you lots of great programs. Hopefully you have gone onto our website or Facebook and seen the new list of programs that we've put out for the next couple of weeks, I think. So take a look at those, put them on your calendar, and make sure and join us for each and every one. Today, we are going to have Ask a Historian with yours truly, Glenn. Now, we've already gotten some questions. I've sort of backed up. I want to start going through those to address some of the ones that people have already asked, and then we'll get to the live questions from our audience. So be thinking about those. Go ahead and put them in, and I promise we'll get to as many as we can. So one of the first questions we got, someone just wanted to know what exactly was the Harlem Renaissance and how did that sort of affect American history? It's a very interesting part of American history. After the American Civil War, and after slavery had ended, of course, there are so many freed persons who want to create a new life, get on with the life that they've suddenly found themselves with. It's hard to express how scary and fantastically amazing it must have been to actually have your own life. And many of those migrated to the North. They wanted to totally get away from the South, where they and their parents had been enslaved, had worked on, and even after the Civil War, had worked on sharecropping farms and things like that. They went to the North. They went to urban places. And one of those urban places they went to is to New York City, and many of them began to settle in what is Harlem. Now, Harlem has come to us today to sort of be a center of African-American culture and identity, but it wasn't always the case. In the early 19th century, it was an area that was meant just as another small part of New York City, but as these folks started, as the African-American folks from the South began moving in, they sort of began to repopulate the area, not totally, but almost exclusively as an African-American zone. Now, they didn't then have a town meeting and say, okay, now we're going to start the Harlem Renaissance. That's not how things work. People lived there, they moved there, they began to work, and like any other group of people, they began to look for things that would entertain them, that they could identify with, that could perhaps help them understand the world better. So they began looking for art, they began looking for literature, they began looking for things to do, things to read, to sort of express this newfound life that they had had, and all of this coalesced into what we've come to call the Harlem Renaissance. And it was during this time in Harlem, we're looking at around the 1920s, people began to write books. They began to write literature. They have these magazines that are published. And really, this is for an African-American audience. It's by African-Americans and for African-Americans. And this intellectual growth also comes with a new social growth. The music that comes out of this, of course, sort of was the proto-jazz, and a lot of it becomes jazz, and is very popular across all races and throughout a large part of the country. The music comes dance halls, and people begin to dress a certain way. And this is where we get zoot suits and things like that. And the women begin to dress ever so scandalously. Sometimes you could even see their knees. Can you imagine such a thing? So all this sort of began to coalesce in this one area of New York City. And people realized that something special was going on. And it continued to grow. And people began to make new music. They began to they continued to write these stories. Langston Hughes is probably, if you had to pick one voice of the Harlem Renaissance, it's probably him. But there are lots of other people involved. And like I said, this is social, this is cultural, this is entertainment, this is all the things that sort of wrap themselves into an urban life, and an urban lifestyle grows right here in Harlem. And of course, this spreads. We start having radio at this time, right? Radio starts to come out, and some of this music starts to spread out. The writing, of course, can go anywhere that books are printed, and a lot of white audiences began to read this, and they can identify a lot with it, even though they might not have the same background, they might not belong to even the same group. There's still the struggles of trying to make it, trying to go somewhere to find a new hope, a new promise, a new way of life, and that resonates across lines of race and socioeconomic status and things like that. So the Harlem Renaissance begins to really blossom, but like so many other things in the country, when the Great Depression comes along, it tends to not kill it, but it certainly starts to lessen the growth, that growth burst that had happened in the 1920s. And that leads us into one of the other questions. Can you talk a little bit about the Great Depression and how it came about? When we think of the Great Depression, we immediately think of the stock market crash of October 1929. That was really, honestly, more of a symptom of things that were going on rather than the cause. That was sort of the thing that kicked it all along the way. This is a very complex time, but basically what happens is it's a big credit bubble, right? People are borrowing a lot of money to put in the stock market so that they can get rich quick. And then when they get rich quick, they'll take the proceeds from their stocks and pay off the loans where they borrowed the money to buy the stocks in the first place. People are also taking a lot of their money and they're putting it into banks. Now, this is before, again, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which is part of the federal government that guarantees that if we put money into a bank today and the bank fails or goes out of business, we'll not lose our money. We'll be able to get that back. That was an outcome of the Great Depression. It was not around in the beginning. So what happens is all these people that have put their money, their life savings into a bank, as the stock market bubble begins to go away and people can't pay back their loans that they borrowed money from, well, the banks are not getting paid back, so the banks go out of business, which means that everyone who had money in those banks, their money's gone. It's just literally gone. They can't access it anymore. They can't pay rent. They can't buy goods. They can't pay their workers if they happen to own a business. So those workers also go out of work. The workers can't buy things, and they don't have a form of income. So this really creates a huge snowball effect so that eventually you get massive unemployment. You get massive troubles with people not able to afford a place to live. They can't afford very much food. They begin to go anywhere they think there may be jobs. And this is where you see a lot of great migrations. The Dust Bowl out in the Midwest and, the Grapes of Wrath, great stories like this. A lot of literature and things come out of that. But the Great Depression happens, and then the government's position sort of is, we'll let the market fix this. We're not going to get too terribly involved. And the country economically, the national economy, gets even worse because the government doesn't take action. Herbert Hoover he is a smart person. He is a very well-educated, very learned person who's president, more or less stays hands-off. This gets FDR elected, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and one of the things he comes into office with is a lot of hope, but he also comes in with this huge lap full of problems, and he has to start addressing this, and he begins to have the government not only help the economy, but almost take over certain parts of it and begin to strongly regulate and provide jobs and things like this. This is where we get the New Deal. Lots of things that we still have today come out of the New Deal. Like I said, FDIC that insures our bank deposits, Social Security, things that are still with us today. Does all this work? Economic historians continue to debate that. Some say it was the coming of World War II that helped pull us out of the economic depression. There's a lot of different theories on that. One thing that we all agree on is that the Great Depression did happen, and it tended to stop. It tended to be negated by our entry into World War II and our involvement in that big global war. So, again, in a nutshell, there's the Great Depression. Someone else asked about Theodore Roosevelt and how he really fits into United States history. So Theodore Roosevelt actually was a small, sickly boy. We think of him as this big, bluff man who was an outdoorsman, but he was, when he was younger, generally sickly, and he was very well read, loved to read books, and loved his mother and the woman he married so very, very much. And they end up dying on the same day of, it's a fever. I'm not sure if it's tuberculosis or scarlet fever or something like that, but they both die on the same day. And of course, as dear as these women were to him, it absolutely crushes his soul and his spirit, and he goes out west to sort of rediscover himself. And this is where we get the image of Roosevelt, the uncle of FDR, by the way, becoming this outdoorsman, this cowboy. And he applied himself. He's like, well, I'm going to go out and I'm going to become robust and I'm going to become strong and all these things. And he eventually gets into politics in New York. He'd been involved before, but he gets involved in politics in New York. He becomes Secretary of the Navy. And, of course, eventually he is elected president. And he's an interesting president. I don't think he really fits into any particular party paradigm that we have today. He was very bluff. He was very much in favor of the common man. He very much believed in the power of the federal government to create parks, to create safety issues, and to ensure safety issues for the American consumer. The Pure Food and Drug Act created the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, which is obviously still very much with us today. They inspect food, they approve drugs that we can use, and medical tests and things like that. National Park Service starts under Theodore Roosevelt. So a lot of things that he sets into motion are very, very centralized. A lot of people did not like him because they thought he was overly aggressive when it came to international approaches. He wanted to create this huge Navy, and he did sail the Navy around the world, more or less, to let the world know that America was here and it was in charge. And he's the one who said, "I will speak softly, but I will carry a big stick." And that big stick was, in fact, the United States Navy. He's a fascinating character. There's a lot to him. I will leave you with this one anecdote to kind of give you an idea of how spiritus and how tough the man was. So he's given a political speech, and someone comes up and they try to assassinate him. They actually shoot him. The bullet actually goes into his body, and he's like, "Oh," finishes the speech before he goes to the hospital to be treated for the gunshot wound. So now it didn't go. It wasn't a huge bullet. It didn't go all the way through, but he was shot, and he did finish the speech before he goes to the hospital immediately following. So that's Theodore Roosevelt for you, not Teddy. He hated the name Teddy, so let's call him Theodore if we may. Another question, another great American statesman, John C. Calhoun. Or I've read different sources that I prefer just because it's neat, who say we should pronounce his name Calhoun rather than Calhoun. Lots of counties around the country are named for it, lots of towns. We have a town and a county here in Georgia named for Calhoun, or Calhoun. Was one of the big three in the early part of the 19th century in the United States Congress. There's also Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, and they sort of get their political start pushing to get us into the War of 1812, and we have a program tomorrow on the War of 1812. But this is where they get their start. They're really in favor of that. They're called the War Hawks, and they want us to get into that war, to fight Britain, to assert ourselves as this new great nation amongst the nations of the world. War of 1812 happens, we get out of it, it creates a national unity, and that national unity, these three men really take advantage of that and begin to push it. But John C. Calhoun starts out as someone who's very nationalist. He believes in a strong federal government. He believes in a national plan to create roads and canals and things like that to expand the economy of the United States using taxpayer money through the federal government. He eventually stops that approach and almost reverses position, becomes very much a states' rights advocate. He becomes very, very pro-slavery. Again, he's a senator from South Carolina, and South Carolina at this point has more African Americans, enslaved Americans in its population than white people. So the rest of his career is really driven by this North versus South pro-slavery attitude, and that has really sort of, especially to our modern sensibilities, marked him as someone not that admirable, even though I think it was during JFK's presidency, a little committee named him one of the 5 great senators of all time. Maybe one of the 5 senators whose influence upon the country was most significant, but I'm not sure I would call him a great senator. If you want to know more about him, of course, there's stuff on Facebook, and if you want to see how crazy some of the hairstyles could get in the 19th century, you definitely want to check out John C. Calhoun. A couple of questions we've already gotten today. One of them was, did women pose as men during the Civil War so that they could fight in the armies? And the answer, as best we can tell, is yes. There are several very clearly documented cases of that. Excuse me. Depending upon how you count it, depending upon how reliable you think the sources are, it could be as many as about 400 documented cases of women serving in the U.S. military during the Civil War. Now, every single one of those has to pretend to be a man. They have to hide the fact that they are female with all of their female parts so that they can get, it's against the rules for women to be in the military in 1860. So they have to hide this fact. They sign up, and some of them join the infantry, some of them go along as spies, and there are photographs that exist of some of these folks. And some of the folks that have come down to us as very popular, not popular, but well-known cases of women who served in the military, close historic examination says these probably weren't. They were probably making the story up to kind of be sensationalist, but some of these are pretty legit. There's one that no one ever discovered, even after the war, that she was a man. She was so convincing. She went through the war. She served in the infantry. She even fought in a couple of battles. Depending on how you want to take this person fought the war, goes on, assumes being a man for the rest of their life, and they're buried as a man. And it's only after the letters that this person wrote home to their family come to light after their death that everyone discovers, wow, this was a female. And she's writing home saying, I hope no one discovers me. I believe in the Union so very, very much. And total surprise to everyone, very convincing on her part. Of course, even if we take the full number at 400, this is still very, very much a minority of the total people who served in the Union Army or even in the Confederate Army during the Civil War. When you're talking about millions of men, having 400 is a small, but it's a very interesting story, and I personally think the most interesting part of that isn't so much the struggles that they had trying to hide who they were, but what were their motivations that make them take such drastic steps. They obviously, these men, very much believed in whatever cause it was that their side was fighting for. They were very ideologically driven to the point that they are totally willing to change their identity, to change who they are to fight for this cause. That's a pretty remarkable dedication to an idea. So that's a very fascinating subject. One that's a little less inspiring, as someone had asked about the slave catchers. This is before the Civil War, of course, before the 13th Amendment, before slaves were freed. And in the North, most northern states had laws against slavery. Southern states allowed slavery. So, of course, if you were a slave, one of the best ways you could get out of your condition was to escape and go to the North. Part of the back and forth between the North and the South before the Civil War requires that the federal government create the Fugitive Slave Act, which basically says any slave who escapes from the South and is caught in the North will be returned to their master. Basically, it's very interesting because the South is very much about states' rights and what each state can choose to do until it comes to the fugitive slave law, in which case they're very much in favor of the national government having power over what the states can and can't decide. In this case, the federal government says regardless of what state you're in, the slave is still considered a slave, still considered property, and if caught, will be returned to their masters in the South. And there were people who made a pretty good living going north trying to find these escaped slaves. So the question really was, how do they know that they've gotten the right one? Sometimes, these are sort of detective stories, right? They're going to find out what the appearance of the person was, what sort of clothes they were wearing when they left, if they had any family they might be trying to escape to, and they would go north and begin to sort of ask questions. Sometimes it was just sheer luck if they found them. Sometimes these slave hunters would just go to the north and sort of just prop themselves up on a busy street and look and see if they could find someone they thought might be an escaped or a fugitive slave. Because at this time, someone who was an African American in the North generally still had to have some sort of paperwork showing that they were a free person. Their manumission papers or a birth certificate showing that they had been born free or things like that. And if they did not have their papers on them, or sometimes if they did, these slave catchers would basically cock them over the head, they would kidnap them, they would take them back south. And even if they had the wrong person, the slave catchers were in this for the reward. The slave catchers were in this for the money, so they're just going to take folks back south. And if it turns out this person is not necessarily an escaped slave, if this is a free person of color, then they'll just go to a slave market and have them sell them and take some of the profit. This is the basis of the movie 12 Years a Slave, which of course is based on an actual account. If you haven't seen that, that's probably one of the best representations of slavery in America ever put on film. So, and it like I said, the idea of these slave catchers is kind of horrific. Some ways you can look at it, it's even more horrific than the actual plantation owners who own the slaves. Again, just, to me personally, trying to go up and profit off of this and rip people apart, it's not a good thing, but there were a significant number of them, and they all used this Fugitive Slave Act to work legally and within the bounds of the law. Another question. Someone just wanted to kind of know about the Vikings and the Norse gods and the Norse religions and things like that. I will tell you that I think that Norse mythology is very interesting, because it has an interesting pantheon of gods. It has, Odin and Thor and Balder and Freya and all these folks, and Loki. And some of us know some of these characters from the new Avengers and the superhero movies, right? Because they've sort of pulled them in. That was the basis for the comics when the comics were first developed. But they were part of the Norse pantheon. And in a nutshell, many different religions, most religions, I should say, are set up about making you a better person, about living a good life so that you will have a pleasant afterlife in some sort of heaven or something like that. And in the end, everything, if you can just make it through this life and do the right thing, in the afterlife, things are going to be better and things are going to be happy. Not so with Norse mythology. It's almost depressing and yet incredibly inspiring. In Norse mythology, you want to be brave, and when you die in battle, you're taken to Valhalla, where you sit amongst other great warriors waiting for the great battle at the end of time called Ragnarok. Ragnarok, you will be led by Odin, the Allfather, the man who's in charge of all the Norse gods, into a great battle, and you will lose. And in the final battle, you and all of your people will lose. And then the giants will take over, and that will be that, and everything will be for naught. That's not very inspiring, because, again, the religion says that you're going to lose no matter what. No matter how good a fighter you are, even in the afterlife, our cause is lost. There's no way we're going to win. And yet, within that mythology, the point is, even if all things are lost, you still try just as hard as you can, because how you live and how you behave and how you comport yourself in the most difficult of circumstances is what matters, not whether you win or lose. And there's sort of something to be said for that. I think that, that's not necessarily Norse behavior. There's a large part across all of human mythology that says that that's an important part of who we should be as people, is how you behave is really what defines you and is really the saving grace of anything, not how things are going to be later on, but how things are now and how you behave to yourself and to your fellow man. So, again, that's Norse mythology. Thor and Balder are really great. Balder's my personal favorite. He's got a very sad, interesting story. That's the ones we have so far. Libba, do we have any questions that folks have already asked live?
So Nolan wants you to talk about the fall of
Constantinople. Okay, so there used to be this thing called the Roman Empire, right? It was, before that, it was the Roman Republic. And this was focused, of course, on the city of Rome in Italy. Why am I talking about Italy? We'll get there in a second. So the Roman Empire the Republic at this point expands out from Italy, and it begins to conquer its neighbors, and it defeats Carthage in North Africa during some of its most violent wars. And then it continues to move east, and it takes over, in effect, the entire Mediterranean. Anywhere where land touches the Mediterranean Sea becomes Rome. And as it gets big, they realize that this is too big an empire to effectively govern. Remember, this is in the days when the fastest thing, it was a 3-mile-an-hour world, right? The fastest things were a ship on the ocean or a horse at a trot. That's how quickly money could move around, communication could move around. So the empire gets so big it can't be governed. So Justinian has the idea to split the empire into two halves, the Western Empire and the Eastern Empire. The Eastern Empire capital is set up at Constantinople, right? So Constantinople remains, from their perspective, Roman. So the Roman Empire falls in the West, right? The Goths, the Visigoths, all that sort of thing, too much to go into right now, but Roman control of its Western Empire basically ceases to exist in a centralized fashion. Eastern Empire continues all the way up through the 800s, the 900s, the 1000s. And again, we come to call this Byzantium, the Byzantine Empire, but they themselves always consider themselves Roman, the descendants of the Roman Empire. And the emperors, the Byzantine emperors, consider themselves Roman emperors. They spoke Greek. Greek was their primary language because this was the Eastern Empire. This is where Greece was. They expand and contract as empires do until finally in 1453, the Turkish and Muslim forces, not Muhammad, I forget which one of the sultans it is, I'm sorry, who finally, after they had fought, and there wasn't much left of Eastern Empire except for the city of Constantinople, and in 1453 it finally falls, and the last Roman emperor is standing inside the last gate of Constantinople and dies there defending the city. So that's the fall of Constantinople, and what that means is that anything Roman more or less ceases to be at that point. It certainly wasn't the same Rome as we saw in Caesar's day and in the early emperors like Trajan and Augustus and folks like that. Very, very different culture. Remember, it's separated by about 600, 700, 800 years. But Constantinople remains in the hands of the Turks. And even, of course, to this day, it's Istanbul, not Constantinople. Thank You, They Might Be Giants, a great song that actually has a good amount of historical basis to it. But the remnants of the empire are still there today. One of the most beautiful buildings in the world, the Hagia Sophia, the loving of wisdom. This was the church that was built in Constantinople. It is now a mosque, but it is absolutely beautiful. You can even go on Google Maps and sort of take a look at it. It's a remarkable building, and it is an architectural, scientific wonder that it was built so long ago and still exists today.
All right, excellent. Can you talk to us about the gold rush in Georgia?
Yeah, so the question is, what about the gold rush in Georgia? And, that's a great question, one that we certainly study here at the Northeast Georgia History Center. When people think of the gold rush, even across the country, most people think of the 49ers going to California for that gold. That's in 1849, hence the name 49ers. But the first big gold rush that happens in the United States happens right here in Northeast Georgia in about 1828 with the discovery of gold on what was then Cherokee land. And according to legend, there's a fellow named Benjamin Parks who's walking along one day and trips over a big rock, and the rock turns out to be a giant hunk of gold. It's apocryphal. Perhaps Benjamin Parks was a person who lived. I've spoken to his descendants. But that was in White County, and there's several counties around this area, but there is a large vein of gold that does run in this area. And for those of you everywhere around the country, the part I'm talking about is about an hour northeast of Atlanta proper. And this was, as I said, Cherokee territory. It was very much an unsettled frontier area until the discovery of gold. And then when word gets out in a newspaper that, Benjamin Parks has discovered gold on this property near this creek, people want to go get the gold. They want to be part of the gold rush. So hundreds of people rush in trying to stake claims, and not even stake claims. If they can just find a stream where they can take a pan and start mining for gold, they might get rich quick. And you have to remember, that's what gold rushes are about, right? They're about getting rich quick. If you start a business, if you have a farm, this takes a lot of work year after year to get to a point where you actually start to make money. If you can walk into a stream and in 3 days have a handful of gold, guess what? You're immediately rich with practically no work. That's the dream, isn't it, folks? But it rarely happens. But people come to this area, and of course the Cherokees don't want all this on their land. The state militia and eventually some parts of the federal army have to come in and control the area. Like I said, the first notice that this happens is in 1828. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 is signed only a couple of years after. It's not the cause of Indian removal, especially for the Cherokee, but it certainly does accelerate the process because people want to get those gold lots. And people do go into Dahlonega. They do begin to at first do placer mining, which is the simple version. Anyone can do this because you just go in with a mule and some supplies and a pan and a pick and a shovel, and you dig in those streams, hoping to find the easy in-place gold. Other people come in with a little more investment, a little more time. There are folks who come in who have a body of slaves that they own, and they put the slaves to work digging in the streams and in areas where gold not be. So it slowly becomes a more industrial process, a more business-driven process. And like all gold rushes, it does eventually seem to play itself out because the gold may still be there, but the easy-to-find gold, the gold that doesn't cost a lot of money or time to get, is more or less gone. And that famous phrase, there's gold in them thar hills, is actually uttered from the courthouse in Dahlonega, right? Because people were like, oh, we're leaving, we're going to go. And there's a man standing up there and says, no, there's gold in them thar hills. You just have to go find it. Now, it's interesting because shows you how gold rushes work. People coming to get the gold, very few of them actually get rich or even break even. But the people who come here to set up stores and shops to supply the people looking for the gold do pretty well because everyone needs shovels and picks and food and whiskey and all the things that they're going to need to sort of stay in place. As a matter of fact, there was a gentleman, an African-American, who was enslaved who ended up buying his own freedom and opening a store, and he did very well for himself in Dahlonega. And Dahlonega is an interesting town. There are two towns that pop up from the gold rush. One is named Dahlonega, and one is named Aurora, which of course is the Latin root word for gold. And these two towns sort of develop, and then it comes to the point after the Cherokee are getting ready to remove, where are we going to put the county seat? Where will be the courthouse? Well, Aurora and Dahlonega begin to compete for who will be the county seat because that's where the prosperity is going to be. Dahlonega wins out, and that's where the 1832 courthouse is today. And Dahlonega is a thriving town. It's based on tourism. It's just to the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. It's beautiful. Where is Aurora today? It is a historic marker on the side of the road on Highway 9. There's not even really a township or anything like that. It faded away. It goes to show you how fickle the fates can be when it comes to a gold rush. And that was America's first gold rush right here in Northeast Georgia.
Very good. Leslie wants to know, what did George Washington do after his presidency?
So the question is, what did George Washington do after his presidency? He had been a very busy man. He had, remember, just to sum up his career, he had been an officer of the Virginia militia during the French and Indian War. He'd gotten great experience there. He had married one of the richest widows in Virginia, Martha Dandridge Custis. After the French and Indian War, he comes back. He tries to build up his estate. He tries to build up his business, his plantation. And then, of course, the troubles that begin the American Revolution happen in New England. He becomes involved with that. He's elected to the Continental Congress. He's eventually appointed general-in-chief of all the Continental armies. So he fights through the war, becomes the father of our country, and then goes back home again thinking, I've done my duty, I'm done. Well, we need a new government and a new constitution for our country. So he's called back one more time to not only help create the Constitution, but when they're making the Constitution and they're writing about what the duties of the president will be, he's the one they have in mind because he's George Washington. So he becomes president of the United States for 2 terms, for 2 4-year terms. So he serves another 8 years in service to the public. And then he's done, right? He wants to go home. He's getting on up there in years. He has his estates to manage. So he goes home. And as he said, he wants to go rest under his fig and vine, fig tree and his vine, which means that he just wants to settle down and live the life of a gentleman farmer. Now, that, of course, means he has estates, and there are enslaved people that work those estates and things like that. But he does become very successful. He creates a brewery. He begins growing wheat. He's actually quite prosperous. He does not go into debt like so many of our other founding fathers trying to make his plantation work. He does very well. He speculates in land, and he more or less takes care of business at home. He is called back to one job when John Adams is president, second president, and he thinks there's going to be a war with France, so there's this big boost to try to get an army together to fight against the French, maybe the British if we need to. And they ask George Washington if he will be general. He very reluctantly agrees, but not much comes of that, and he goes back home and lives his life out until 1799, and that's when he passes away due to a cold, basically, from riding around checking on his estates, checking on his business in bad weather. So that's what he did. He more or less tended to his own during that time, and with one not very significant exception, totally withdrew himself from public life.
Mandy is from Athens, and she has heard that there were Union prisoners of war who were held on the UGA campus during the Civil War. If you do know anything about that, she'd like to know more.
Yeah. Mandy wants to know if I know anything about the Union prisoners kept on the university campus during the Civil War. I'll be honest, I don't actually know anything about that, but it would not surprise me if they did.
I found a little bit about it.
Yes.
It was in 1864, and they were on their way to Andersonville. So maybe you could speak.
Oh yes, so it's Quick Libba actually found that they were some there. They kept them there because they were on their way to Andersonville. Andersonville, and down in close to Millen. No, I'm sorry. There was another POW camp in Millen. Andersonville was the main prisoner of war camp for a good part of the Confederacy. And this is where the Union prisoners of war went and were kept. The camp was built to house a certain number of soldiers, 4, 5, 10 times the number of soldiers it was meant to house were actually kept there. So they were probably having to stagger the soldiers that they went in, which is probably why they stayed at the Georgia campus. And Andersonville, of course, has come to be known as one of the great horrors of the Civil War, that the soldiers were very poorly treated, they were very poorly fed, they were very poorly taken care of in terms of medicine and in terms of shelter and things like that. And these are all very true things. There's no denying that. And they probably could have been treated a little bit better than they were. But the thing you have to remember is that the South was incredibly short of resources for its own people, for its own army, and they could not, some of the soldiers at Andersonville were getting almost the same ration as the Confederate soldiers were. Their conditions, they were being kept in a very malarial, wet place. They weren't allowed to move around. But there were also prisoner of war camps in the North that were pretty bad too. And I'm not going to get into whose camps were worse or better than Norse or the South's. Being a prisoner of war is a very, very bad thing, and you can look through history and see that those experiences have always been pretty bad. But if you go to Andersonville today, they have the site there. It's a National Historic Site, and interestingly, they have a museum there not just about Civil War Andersonville, but it's the National Prisoner of War Museum, and they've got some fantastic exhibits. They tell a great story, it's a story of heart-rending tragedy, but also of triumph. It's a really remarkable story and set of stories they tell there. So if you get a chance, after quarantine and after we can all travel around, that's one of those museums I strongly suggest that you go to.
Connor, who's 9 and from Texas, wants to know, how did Davy Crockett die at the Alamo?
Connor from Texas wants to know how Davy Crockett died at the Alamo. First, it's David, and as a Texan, you should know that. Apparently he did not like the name Davy, so we'll do our best to refer to him as David. Now, I also know I've got several friends from Texas, and me beginning to talk about how David Crockett might have died at the Alamo and how he performed sort of gets into almost a religious discussion with some folks. The best that we can tell is that David Crockett was probably captured by the Mexican forces storming the Alamo and did not die in combat. We think, based on some of the diaries written by some of the Mexican officers, that a group of defenders was captured, David Crockett being among them, and that they were eventually executed. This is totally believable, as the Mexican army had already executed several hundred soldiers, wounded or not, that they had captured at Goliad. And so this was standard practice for the Mexican army. But the Mexican army was in a serious situation because they had this entire huge area full of people that it was trying to repress a rebellion, and they could not afford to have a big trail of prisoners. They could not afford to have bodies of these rebels hanging out here and there at different places. They had to move quick. So the Mexican army, from a purely military point of view, did not have much choice. But of course, what happens at the Alamo is that David Crockett and the defenders there become martyrs for the cause of Texas independence. And it has a incredible boost to morale, and it inspires the other Texans to fight against Santa Anna and the Mexican army that much harder because of what happened. It's one of those things where I don't think Santa Anna quite realized exactly the effect that it was going to have on the Texans, which were at this point mostly, but not entirely, Americans, white Americans from usually the southern states. So David Crockett is a very fascinating figure, a congressman from Tennessee. He fought in the War of 1812, goes to Texas, and I don't think he intended to die there, but it has certainly helped us remember him and has made him practically immortal.
Shannon has a descendant who fought for the Confederacy, was captured, and then enlisted in the Union Army, and she wants to know if this was common.
So Shannon has an ancestor who was fighting for the Confederacy, was captured, and then was freed on the condition that they enlist in the Union Army. And then they did, and they continued to fight in the Union Army. Her question is, was this common? Probably more common than you think. You have to remember that North and South, but especially in the South, a lot of the Confederate forces were raised through the draft. There was conscription that went on. And so if you were conscripted and you had to go fight for the Confederacy, you were there for the Confederacy. You may not even necessarily believe in the causes in which you were fighting for. And if you were captured, if you deserted and got over to the Union side, maybe you would be much more interested in fighting for the cause of Union than you would be for the causes of the Confederacy. So, not really something that happened a lot, but something that did happen. I've read about that happening several times. And of course, the Union was happy to have these. This was especially this stuck in the Confederacy, but having a pro-Union sentiment was very common here in Northeast Georgia. Northeast Georgia was a hotbed of Unionism before the American Civil War because the topography of itself. This is not but it's a big reason. The topography and geography of Northeast Georgia is very mountainous, and as a result, it doesn't lend itself to large swaths of flat plantation lands where you can have a lot of profitable cash crops like rice or cotton or things like that. So the quantity of the planter class of slave owner is not as prevalent here. So when it comes time in 1860 for Georgia to have its convention where it decides whether or not it will secede from the Union, a large contingent from Northeast Georgia, from the different counties here, goes to that convention. And only 2 out of about 30 delegates from Northeast Georgia vote in favor of secession. The rest of them vote against it. Not that they're necessarily anti-slavery, but they do not want to leave the Union. So Northeast Georgia is very much has a lot of Unionist sentiment, and even though it's sort of pulled in the Confederacy and it's forced to provide men, it's forced to provide food and supplies for the Confederacy. It's not something that this area was necessarily eager to do, and there's been some great research done on that. I think I might have mentioned it before. There's a fellow named Jonathan Saris who has a book called A Separate Civil War, and if you can get a hold of that, if you're interested in the home front of Northeast Georgia, it's a fascinating subject.
All right. Let's see. Leslie would like to know if Lewis and Clark traveled through Texas.
Leslie would like to know if Lewis and Clark traveled through Texas. I assume you mean during their exploration. No, they did not. They left from, of course, they had to get all of their supplies and their men together at the Mississippi River at St. Louis, and then from St. Louis they left and went up the Missouri, because what they were looking for really was the Northwest Passage, a waterway that could go from the Pacific Ocean all the way to the Mississippi. That's what they were looking for. They didn't really go to the south. And even then, even though the terms of where Louisiana actually began and ended were somewhat vague based on the treaty and the terms of sale with France, Texas, it was well known, was not really part of the purchase. That was pretty solidly Spanish territory, and the Spanish made sure that everyone was aware of that. But of course, the United States did eventually get that territory eventually, but not for another 40 years or so.
Okay. Can you tell us about the 1918 Spanish influenza and how many people died in the United States?
Yeah, so this is something, of course, we've had some questions on. This is something that I think is on a lot of people's minds, is what was the Spanish flu, the epidemic of 18, 19, and a little bit of 20 like? Well, it was very serious, and part of the problem was we're not sure where it started. It gets the name the Spanish flu because for media reports, it seems that may be the first place that a lot of cases were reported. It could have started in Kansas and gone over to Europe with American doughboys going to fight in World War I. It's just hard to tell, but we do know that it took a little bit for it sort of to get traction, and it wasn't until pretty close to the end of World War I that you start seeing lots of cases, especially amongst soldiers at the front from all sides. And the trick is, after the war's over, what does a soldier want to do more than anything else? They want to go home. And the people at home want their sons and their fathers and their brothers to come back home as well. So there's a massive movement to get these soldiers home as quickly as possible. Well, a lot of these soldiers have flu, so the flu spreads everywhere all over the world. And the numbers of deaths we're not really sure about. The guesstimates range anywhere from 20 million to 100 million. Now, that's deaths. That's not just people infected. That's actual deaths. 20 million to as high as 100 million of the population. That's more people than were killed during the entire 4 years of World War I. So this is a fantastically huge thing. And I don't want to get too gloom and doom, but when you look at the Spanish flu, there was a huge increase in the number of cases and the number of deaths, and then it sort of went away, and then there was another little bump. There was a second wave of the flu that comes. And one of these waves actually affected 20 to 30-year-olds more than any other age group. Today with COVID-19, we're looking at the high-risk groups are some of the old folks, 65 and above. Those are the ones that are at risk. Turns out with the Spanish flu, a particular portion of the population that seemed to be more vulnerable were the younger folks. Was this because they had gotten, bad food and not a lot of health care during the World War I years? We don't know. But then after that second wave, the Spanish flu goes away. And like COVID, it's a respiratory-based disease. It's spread through contact. It's spread through, air droplets and things like that. And people did use quarantines. Quarantine was a way to try to prevent the spread. People did use a mask. Now, of course, they're not the mask like we have today. Many of the masks would just be a simple linen covering that would go over the mouth. but the United States did use the Army to help quarantine some areas, and some population centers during the Spanish flu were hit much more strongly than others. This is how the spread of disease and epidemiology works. The stronger, the more dense the population concentration, the more cases you're going to get. So during the Spanish flu, Philadelphia, for example, was very, very badly hit by this. And other places that instituted quarantines, and they didn't call them stay-at-home orders, but that's in effect what they were. Turns out those were pretty effective. So while our technology may have changed in ways we address this and ways we try to limit it, a lot of the preventative measures are the exact same and just as effective as they were 100 years ago.
All right. Audrey, who is 10, wants to know, did Rosa Parks know that she was starting the Montgomery bus boycott when she refused to give up her seat on the bus?
So Audrey wants to know, she's 10, she wants to know if Rosa Parks knew she was starting something big, if she started the Montgomery bus boycott, and which sort of was the seed that created the civil rights movement in the late 50s and 1960s. It's a hard question to know. A lot of people have looked at that. A lot of people have asked her, and she never really, I don't think, came out and said that it was one or the other. I think, imagine, put yourself in her shoes. You've just gotten off of work. You have worked a long day. You have been on your feet all day long, and all you want to do is get on the bus and go home and get something to eat and maybe rest. So you get on the bus and you sit down with your aching feet, and some guy tells you, hey, you need to get up and keep walking. Go to the back of the bus. No! And it was what was going through her mind. I'm not a mind reader, but, it's hard to know, but probably a combination of, you're only saying this because I'm an African American and these segregation laws are in place. But also, no, I'm tired. No, I'm not going to do it. And of course, she was arrested because this was against the law. Notice a trend that always the legal thing may not be the right thing. And so this became, today it seems incredibly silly that we would have laws that would determine based on the color of a person's skin where on a bus they could sit, or where in a waiting room they could sit. It's crazy to us, but it was the law then. And so this law, which even people at the time realized, a lot of people at the time realized and agreed that it was just fundamentally unfair, began to agitate to change that law. And when that law starts to be questioned, a lot of other laws start to be changing. And that's something to remember, is that the beginning of the civil rights movement was simple things. It was like moving to the back of the bus. It was, where in the restaurant are we allowed to sit? Can we purchase the same things at the same price as white people? And it began from an economic perspective. But even Martin Luther King addressed this, and he said, we began our protest against these things based on where we could sit or on the cost of a hamburger. But we are now wanting everyone to see that these are just things to address. There are fundamental underlying issues that we also have to address to make things right. Getting the price of a hamburger fixed, or where you can sit on a bus, that's important, but that's not what we're really trying to do. We're trying to really change the way society works. So did she realize that she was about to change the way society works? I have no idea. But I like to think that at the time she didn't. She just wanted to be left alone, like so many of us, when we're tired.
Speaking of Martin Luther King, was he ever put into prison? Rebecca, who is 11, wants to know.
Rebecca, yeah, that's a good question. Was Martin Luther King ever put into jail? And he was indeed. That's sort of, especially during the civil rights movement in the 1960s, that was sort of a price you had to pay to be in favor of, or to agitate for something that you believe is right. Like sitting in the wrong place on a bus. Technically, Rosa Parks did break the law. She did have to go to jail. Martin Luther King did break a law. He had to go to jail. But just the act of going to jail for such a cause not only lent credence to his cause, but it helped other people see how outrageous some of the things he was protesting against were. And it inspired him that he wrote this work, A Letter from a Birmingham Jail. And this letter that he wrote when he was in jail, this specific time, he was in jail, I want to say 2 or 3 times.
29.
Excuse me, 29 times he was arrested. Once again, legal does not always equal right. But, this letter from a Birmingham jail encapsulates and becomes sort of the manifesto of what the civil rights movement is really about. And it is widely published and it is widely seen as sort of the impetus for what not only gets the civil rights movement going, but catapults Martin Luther King Jr. to national recognition and leadership of the entire civil rights movement. So, yes, he did go to jail for a cause that he believed in, for I would argue, a just cause. And sometimes when you do the right thing, you're going to face consequences that may seem unfair at the time, but in retrospect will perhaps only make you a stronger person.
Can you give us an idea of who was Cleopatra? Was she real?
Yeah, so the question is, who was Cleopatra? Was she even real? She was real. She was well, there were several Cleopatras, but we're going to focus on the one I think we all think of. She was Queen of Egypt, ruler of Egypt. Actually, her younger brother was king of Egypt during when Julius Caesar was in charge of Rome, let's say, as first citizen, as proconsul. And Egypt is technically part of the Roman Empire, and it's one of the wealthiest parts of the Roman Empire. We think of Egypt today sort of as the pyramids and as desert. Well, this is the time when the pyramids, even then, are ancient, and it's not a desert. Egypt along the Nile is actually very rich, a very bountiful, a very fruitful area. And as a result, it was a very rich part of the empire. So Rome wanted to make sure that it could control it, that it could get access to those taxes from Egypt. And one of the ways that it was able to do that is to create this relationship with the Egyptian royal family, the Ptolemies. Now, many portrayals of Cleopatra as sort of an African queen are not accurate. Cleopatra and her family were more or less Greek. They were from Greek stock, and they were manipulative because they're trying to make themselves sovereign within the greater power of the Roman Empire. So at first, Cleopatra and Julius Caesar become very good friends, and that's to secure Egypt's place in the Roman Empire that Caesar's trying to build. When Caesar is killed, then his not his heir, his very close friend, Mark Antony, also becomes very close to Cleopatra, and they are in rebellion against Caesar's actual heir, Augustus, and they sort of have a civil war. And in the end, Augustus, who becomes the first emperor of Rome, goes and fights a war, and Antony and Cleopatra both have to commit suicide to avoid capture by Caesar. So she was a real person. She was involved at one of those very critical moments of Roman history and Egyptian history.
All right, I think that's all we have time for today.
Okay. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. It's 3 o'clock. Well, thank all of you for joining us. I've had a great time. I love these question and answer sessions. Thank you so much for tuning in with us. We have as I said, we had a great schedule coming up in the next couple of weeks, so please join us for those if you can. Keep sending in your questions. I think we're going to try to do Ask a Historian on Mondays now. Are we going to sort of set that as a standard for Mondays? So we'll see you for the rest of the week and the following weeks. Send in questions if you have them. Thank you so much for being a part of our family here at the Northeast Georgia History Center. If you can, give us any support. We, of course, appreciate that. And if you can't, just tell all your friends, tell everyone you know to tune in here 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time to take advantage of these programs. And until tomorrow, y'all take care.